So tell us a little bit more about what's happening with Islam in America, and if you think there's hope in eradicating this threat. I mean, removing Islam completely from the West.
I actually talk about a red, green, blue axis. We've got the Islamists, we've got the communists, and we've got the globalists. And the Director of Policy and Planning on the National Security Council in 2017, during the first Trump administration, wrote a marvelous memo. I encourage everybody to read it. It's called the Higgins Memo. You should be able to find it very easily. And he described this international alliance of globalists, communists, and jihadists who he said were working together for the purpose of destroying the United States of America, not just as a nation, but as an ideal. And I think that's what we're watching here, right? Islam has always been a threat to civilization and always been a threat to innocent people everywhere, but it's so backwards that they really were not a major threat to the United States of America until our government opened up the borders and started importing them in huge numbers. The same is true for Canada. I mean, before they got the technology from the West, they were so backwards they could barely feed themselves, right? Islam is a very destructive ideological and political system that produces nothing, that destroys everything. And so, yes, Europe was threatened constantly by Islam. They had multiple Islamic invasions. But here in America, it really wasn't a big deal. I always remind people, and this is even true in Europe, until globalist and communist politicians voted to open up the borders and start mass importing Muslims, there was no real Islamic threat. All the armies of the Muslim world combined could not have come close to American soil if we had not invited them all here, if treasonous forces within our own government had not invited them here. So why did they invite them here? Well, I think the reason is very simple. They want to use them to destroy America, to destroy our country. So you do have this alliance that on the surface seems very bizarre. You know, why would they be working together? Well, that's because they have a common enemy. That enemy is Christ. That enemy is Christian civilization. That enemy is the United States of America, because, of course, it is a Christian civilization built on Christian principles, very similar to Canada, very similar to much of Western Europe. And so I don't think any of these threats can be understood on its own. Yes, Islam on its own is always going to be a threat to people who are in the nearby vicinity, right? If you don't believe me, ask North Africa, right? North Africa was at one time Christian. North Africa at one time had civilization until Muhammad's armies came through and chopped off everybody's heads and forced everybody to either submit to Islam or pay the jizya tax. So we're going to have to deal with this, but I think to deal with it, we're first going to have to deal with the forces within our own government that did this.
Hello and welcome to a brand new season of the Empower Hour. It's so good to see you here after a few weeks off, and we're glad you can join us. Our guest speaker this evening is Alex Newman, and the title of tonight's show is Warning: Is Canada Becoming Venezuela 2.0? It's January 14th, 2026, and this is the Empower Hour. Tonight's interview is pre-recorded, and Tanya is taking time off to work on some important actions, so I'm going to head right over to our guest's introduction. It's always such a pleasure to have Alex Newman join us on the Empower Hour. Alex is an author, educator, speaker, and award-winning journalist. He's the founder of Liberty Sentinel and the executive director of Public School Exit, a successful American campaign that encourages and empowers parents to pull their children out of the corrupt public school system. In this pre-recorded interview, Alex joins Tanya to examine recent developments in Venezuela and their far-reaching worldwide implications. So now, my friends, I invite you to sit back and get comfortable as we listen to this very important and informative conversation between Tanya Gaw and Alex Newman.
Well, welcome to the Empower Hour. I'm the host, Tanya Gaw, and the founder of Action for Canada. And the topic tonight is going to be incredibly important in connecting what's happening in Venezuela, what is going on in Canada over the last decade under the rule of Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney. There's more to this story than narco-terrorism, drug cartels, oil and Maduro colluding with Russia, Iran, and China. The broader operation and central mission has been to undermine and destroy the United States and Western democratic nations in order to impose communism, socialism, and authoritarian rule using drug addiction, overdoses, and election interference as weapons. And there's nobody I know better than to join me on the show tonight than our friend Alex Newman, who is also someone who has lived in Mexico and Latin America. I would say that he is an expert in this field. And so first, I want to welcome you, Alex, to the show. And then I want to cover a few of your books before we dive into this important conversation.
It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much, Tanya. It's a great honor.
Okay, super. And so the other day I was watching a video, and again, it was several months ago. I know that you've been reporting on this for a number of years, and I happened to hear that you have a new book coming out, Woke and Weaponized, How Karl Marx Won the Battle for American Education and How We Can Win It Back. That sounds very promising. Can you tell us a little bit about this new book?
Well, thank you, Tanya. So I co-wrote it with Robert Bortons, who's the CEO of Classical Conversations. It's the largest network of homeschooling in the world. They've got about 140,000 students, including my own children, by the way. And what we decided was that somebody needed to do this, and nobody was doing it, so we finally decided to do it. But essentially, the government school system has been completely captured and taken over by people who hate God, who hate the Bible, who hate our civilization, who hate the principles and moral order that God ordained. And they are using this system to destroy our children and destroy our civilization. I believe it's one of the most urgent threats that we are facing today. And unfortunately, there's also been some, I would call them false solutions that are being proffered now that I think actually are a mortal danger to home education and Christian education. And so we wrote this book really to sound the alarm about what's happening for parents who aren't aware, and also to offer some ideas on solutions. You know, how do we, first of all, protect our own families? And then how do we as a society get out of this mess that has been caused by now generations of indoctrination, sexualization, dumbing down of the next generation? And ultimately, Tanya, if we don't do this right, if the totalitarians, if the evildoers capture the hearts and minds of the next generation, everything else we're doing is for nothing anyway. Right? I mean, the evildoers are going to win. So this is the key battle that we need to focus on. The book is going to be out officially very soon. Should be on Amazon, hopefully within the next week or two. We'll see. But people can pre-order right now, and I've got copies, so I'm sending them out already. I just sold a couple hundred just in the last few days. But people can order that at my website, libertysentinel.org, if they want to get it. Unfortunately, I have to charge shipping to Canada, which I don't know what it is, but I think it's a lot. But, that's one way to get it. So.
Okay, awesome. And you have been on the show so many times as we've talked about education and as you say, 911, the schools are on fire, remove your children. And the other side definitely knows that the way to control the future is through the hearts and minds of our children and capturing those in these indoctrination centers that they call public funded education. You are also involved with Classical Conversations in the United States. I want to encourage our viewers to look up and follow Alex, go on to Liberty Sentinel to access all of the links and information, as well as on Action for Canada's page. If you go to current issues, current events, you will see that we have a homeschool revolution going on here in Canada as well. And I was encouraged by stats that I saw. I was reading last week that showed comparisons from the 80s to the 90s, the massive increase in parents who are removing their children from the education system and choosing to homeschool, and how this is going to really shift our battle against the tyrants that are working to take control of them. And so now on that as well, I want to move towards, you also have written the Deep State. This book was incredible in exposing what was going on down in the United States, as it says, the invisible government behind the scenes. And I understand that you have a revised version coming out soon.
Yes. So we had the first edition was actually published in 2020, very early on in the COVID pandemic. And, it had a lot of information about what was going on at the time. We are releasing a revised second edition now because so much has happened over the last 5 years that we thought we needed to kind of bring it up to the present moment. I still like the old edition. It's still got a lot of useful information that unfortunately we had to cut out to make space for the new stuff. But the new edition will be out, I would think, within the next couple of months. I've already sent the manuscript to the publisher. They're doing the finishing touches on it, and that'll be available also by Amazon or through my website. The first edition is still available. The second edition will be available within the next few months, I think.
Okay, and I know in 2025, during Trump's second term here, there's been so much more that is being exposed publicly. The mainstream media can no longer ignore it as well. So you were on the front line of that. And Alex, I just want to thank you so much. You certainly are an award-winning international journalist, and that you do your work. You have great connections, and we really appreciate that. Before we move along as well, Trenzio, if you just want to bring up his two other books, I have one here, Crimes of the Educators, as well of they are indoctrinating our children to death. So if this is the first time you're hearing about Alex Newman, I highly encourage you to get plugged in and follow the work that he is doing, because what is happening in America affects Canada. There is this ripple effect as citizens wake up. Then they start paying attention more carefully to who they're electing into office. And it will be a battle in Canada coming into the next election to get these tyrants removed here as well. So with that, Alex, as I did a deep dive into what is going on in Venezuela, it brought me back to many, many years ago. Really, this is what started my advocacy and working to expose what our deep state in Canada is doing. And that started for my journey with the legalization of marijuana in Canada and putting it in the hands of 12-year-olds. And my MP happened to be a Liberal. His name is Ken Hardy. And I was challenging him consistently on why would they legalize marijuana, providing them all the stats that this was going to cause harm, actually bringing stats from Colorado was one of the go-tos at the time, and then comparing it to what the Queen of Sweden was doing in eliminating, like banning all drugs and making them all illegal. And what a lot of people may not know, that when they got elected with a majority government in 2015, the Liberals had their first convention in April of 2016. And as I continued to move through and challenge the Liberal MP, he said, "Oh, we're modeling our drug policy after Venezuela." And 10 and a half years ago, I didn't know about Venezuela. I didn't know how the regime had come in and destroyed it. And then how incrementally, it's not just, legalization of drugs and hard drugs that the Liberal government is pursuing. It was to advance the legalization of prostitution, anything immoral on one level, but then also to impoverish us and turn us into a social state. So I would like you to inform our viewers the history of Venezuela, how they fell, and we'll move into what should we be looking for and doing here in Canada, as you are also responding to this very strongly in the United States.
Well, thanks, Tanya. And, the history of Venezuela is very interesting. As you mentioned, I grew up in Latin America. I lived almost my entire childhood in Latin America, primarily Mexico and Brazil. But of course, I've been to almost every major Latin American country and spent a lot of time there. And Venezuela, after declaring independence from Spain and becoming an independent nation, they actually, like many other Latin American countries, Argentina chief among them, was starting to become very prosperous. So Venezuela was developing a middle class. Obviously, it was blessed with enormous amounts of natural resources. But unfortunately, a communist terrorist by the name of Hugo Chavez was able to seize control of that country, with help from the Cubans, by the way. And from there, it got worse and worse and worse. I think the best way to understand Venezuela is really as a colony of communist Cuba. But before we move on Venezuela, there's a couple things that I think are really important for people to understand. Fidel Castro in the 1990s, actually in the year 1990, decided with his masters in Moscow that armed struggle, armed revolution, these so-called national wars of liberation, was probably not going to be the most effective way to conquer the rest of the Western Hemisphere for this hideous satanic ideology known as communism. And I don't even regard it as a real ideology per se, but we can come back to that. And so he and his friend Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who is currently the illegitimate president of Brazil, got busted out of jail, he was in jail for good reason, by his other criminal buddy, Justice Alexandre de Moraes, the head of the Supreme Court in Brazil. They created a network in Sao Paulo called the Sao Paulo Forum. In Spanish, it's El Foro de San Pablo. In Portuguese, it would be Foro de Sao Paulo. And the initial meeting actually brought together this incredibly interesting cast of characters. You had a narco-terrorist group in Colombia called the FARC, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. You had the Sandinistas, mass murdering communists in Nicaragua, all came together, and they set up this network and decided that the way to conquer the region was going to be through elections. But they knew they couldn't just win elections by advertising that, hey, we want to be more like Cuba, right? And so that's where the criminal gangs came in. That's where the FARC came in, which for decades had been slaughtering innocent Colombians, had been brutalizing the people of that region with terrorism, with assassinations, with all sorts of terror, and then using cocaine trafficking as the primary moneymaker. So Castro had his eyes on Venezuela early on because of all the money that Venezuela had, especially with the oil reserves that they had. And so they took over Venezuela, and Venezuela eventually became essentially the cash cow for this subversive communist network. The oil money, the drug money, all of it was being used to fund the revolution across the hemisphere. Now, yes, they had backing from the Kremlin. Yes, they had backing from Beijing, but really the big source of funds was criminal networks. And FARC was, by the way, just one of many narco-terrorist organizations that was involved. The ELN, the MIR in Chile, I mean, all these different criminal terrorist organizations. In Brazil, this is actually why Lula was in prison, the current president. He was caught stealing money from Brazilian taxpayers through a construction company called Odebrecht. Essentially what had happened was they were looting the state-owned Brazilian oil company Petrobras, and they were looting the taxpayers through inflated contracts given to this construction company called Odebrecht, and then using the money, yes, to buy nice houses and cars and all the rest of it, fund their bank accounts, but also to fund communist candidates and movements in other parts of Latin America. So they were well on their way to taking over this region, fueled by Venezuelan money and the communist Chinese, until Donald Trump stepped in and put a stop to it. So that's kind of the history in a nutshell. I think it's very important for people to understand. It's not just about drugs. It's certainly not just about oil. It's about stopping a communist network that fully intended to capture the entire region of Latin America and then ultimately the entire Western Hemisphere. And here's the worst part, Tanya. Yes, the key backers were in Beijing and in Moscow, but also, and of course, Iran was involved, Hezbollah, Hamas, I mean, all these groups intersected in Venezuela. But they also had huge support from what I call the deep state here in the United States. They were being aided and abetted by Barack Obama. They were being aided and abetted by Joe Biden. They were being aided and abetted by George Soros. And the evidence for this is overwhelming. I've been covering it for over 15 years in the New American Magazine and other publications. So it's a very, very dangerous network. Very few people outside of U.S. intelligence and the U.S. State Department understand it. And unfortunately, a lot of the people in U.S. intelligence and the State Department who understand it are helping them. So we've got those problems to deal with.
All right. Yeah. So thank you for that bit of history. And now I really, what I hope, my goal is today that our viewers will really understand how the model for Venezuela, they weren't satisfied with just taking over all of this region in Latin America. And of course, Mexico has been lost for quite some years as far as drug cartels, but how they have incrementally shifted that into the West. And America, I want to say, was kind of ground zero as far as a target, but Canada has been equally hit as far as implementing leaders that would go along with, really, we call it communism, but that globalism. All of these global leaders are wanting a piece of this because they see that it helps them destroy the democracies in the West, which is what their goal is. So Trump coming into office, when I look at what he accomplished in the year and then how he finished off the year and began this year, I mean, this is transformational, not only for the United States, but every Western nation. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I think Donald Trump continues to deal really devastating blows to the globalist deep state. Just a few days ago, we had an incredible announcement that we're now leaving 66 international organizations, about half of those UN agencies, including the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, including UN Women, including the UN Population Fund, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These are wicked, subversive, evil organizations that are working to destroy civilization and enslave humanity. So Trump is doing really some heroic things. I wouldn't say I agree with all the things that he's done, and certainly not all the things that he's said. But the fact that he has been able to hit the globalists and the deep state so hard and remain standing is absolutely astounding. In fact, I think it's nothing short of miraculous, actually. And we see this across a whole sphere of different policy areas and geopolitical issues. When it comes to what was happening in Venezuela, there's an even bigger picture. And you're right, it affects Canada probably even more so than the United States. But to really understand, I think, what's happening with the communist movement in Latin America, we need to understand that this is actually a global phenomenon, right? So even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a number of defectors. I would argue the most important defector who ever came to America was a guy by the name of Anatoly Golitsyn. I have his books. I've read them. They're phenomenally important. One is called New Lies for Old. The other is The Perestroika Deception. And what he warned, first the American government and later the American public in the early 80s, because the American government wasn't listening, was that there was a long-range disinformation plan that he worked on. He was in the Department D, the disinformation department in the KGB, and there was a long-range disinformation plan, he said, to have a phony collapse, a phony crumbling of communism so that they could finally put the West to sleep and eventually weaken us to the point where we could be conquered. And he warned that all of this was going to happen many, many years before it happened. He gave a series of about 205, you might say 206, very specific predictions about what was going to happen. Of those, about 200 have come true. There's only a handful that we're still waiting for. I'll give you some examples. He said they were going to bring down the Berlin Wall. He said there would be a phony collapse of the Soviet Union. And he said what you're going to see is a collapse of the Soviet Union, but all the same criminals are going to stay in power. They're going to form new political parties. They're going to purchase state assets for pennies on the dollar, but ultimately the same criminals will remain in charge. It'll happen in Bulgaria. It'll happen in Romania. Even in Poland, he said there's going to be a fake anti-communist revolution in Poland led by a guy called Lech Walesa. And of course, we all know Lech Walesa, the glorious leader of the anti-communist uprising, the Solidarity movement. Well, we had already been warned about Lech Walesa by Anatoly Golitsyn. Turns out, now that we have the KGB archives partially opened, we know that Lech Walesa was a KGB agent. His codename was Bolek. So all of the predictions that Anatoly Golitsyn made up until a certain point have come true, about 200 out of 205 or 206. The last prediction, the grand finale, you might say, is what he described as a second October revolution. He said the communists in Moscow, the communists in Beijing, and their communist allies all over the world, when the time was right, would undertake a second October revolution, a throwback to the October Revolution that ended up collapsing Russia and enslaving Russia, but that this would be global in scope, and it would happen when America was weak enough to finally take down. So they've been working on this for a long time. They've been trying to take America's the prize, right? We love you guys in Canada, but Canada could fall or rise, and it wouldn't mean final victory for communism. America's a different story. If America falls, it's over, folks, unless God Himself comes and actively intervenes. And so America has long been the prize, and they tried everything they could to take down America. To go back to Cuba for a minute, most Canadians probably don't even remember this, but we had a vicious, vile terrorist group in the United States, even before I was born. This was 60s, 70s, called the Weather Underground. They were very famous and notorious at the time. They bombed the Pentagon, right where our Department of Defense is. They bombed the State Department. They bombed the Capitol, where our Congress meets. They murdered American police officers while they were robbing banks and robbing money trucks. And then they bombed the funerals of the police officers so they could kill more of them and their friends and family. It's basically try to strike terror in the hearts of Americans. And we now know they were working hand in glove with the communist Cuban dictatorship, with the DGI, the General Directorate of Intelligence in Havana. Now, that was interesting. Now, the guy who infiltrated the leadership of the Weather Underground, his name was Larry Grathwohl. He was an FBI operative, and he penetrated the highest level of the Weather Underground, the leadership committee. And he actually revealed all this before he died in public interviews. He said he found out what they were planning to do was kick off a revolution in the United States that would sow chaos and terror everywhere. Nobody would know what to do. There would be assassinations. There would be civil war, violence in the streets. And amidst the chaos, he said, they would have the Soviets come occupy part of the East Coast. They would have the Communist Chinese and the North Koreans occupy part of the West Coast. The Cubans would get the Southeast. Some of the Central American communists would get parts of the Southwest. And as part of that, Larry Grathwohl, the FBI operative, said, well, what about the people who are counter-revolutionaries, the people who won't go along with this? He said, oh, no, don't worry, we got that planned for as well. We're going to build a network of concentration camps where we're going to be putting those people and re-educating them. And he's, well, what about the ones who can't be re-educated? And Grathwohl says they openly acknowledge that their plan was to exterminate about 10% of the American population, about 25 million people. So why is all that relevant today? Well, the Cuban connection, obviously. But here's the really interesting part. The founder of that terrorist organization was a guy by the name of William Ayers, Bill Ayers. He was able to get off on a technicality. He was arrested. He was prosecuted. He should have probably been executed under federal law for the vicious acts of terrorism he perpetrated against our country in service to a hostile foreign regime that was trying to overthrow our system of government. He was not executed. In fact, he was let off on a technicality. He was able to go free. And he bragged about this. Hey, guilty as sin and free as a bird. Isn't that cute? Great justice system here. We obviously need to do some reforms there. But he was very proud of this. And he went into education. He became a professor of education. And then he eventually ended up at Teachers College at Columbia. So a few years after that, he launched the political career of a virtually unknown community organizer named Barack Hussein Obama. Literally, Barack Obama first ran for state senate in Illinois. And the start of his political career, the first public event they did, was in Bill Ayers' living room. So if you read Bill Ayers' books, he understood that the reason the revolution had not succeeded back when they tried it in the 70s was that Americans were still too traditional. The younger generations had not been fully captured. So education was critical to making this succeed. Secondarily, he said, we've got to get business. Without business, we will not be able to take down America. Well, they are much further along now than they were back then. They've captured the hearts and minds of most of our young people. They've captured many of our major businesses. And I think they now believe they are getting closer to success. I think Trump has been a big obstacle for them, but they're playing the long game. So we've got a lot of big issues that need to be dealt with.
Yeah, it's really, really concerning, when you have an understanding of actually what's taking place. And that's why I felt it was very important for you to come on the show, explain the history to currently what's going on. You mentioned Barack Obama. There's Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden, I think, is a useful idiot as much as Justin Trudeau was. And in Canada, I just want to read something that Western Standard had put out this morning. And of course, I hope that people will read the action in relation to this Empower Hour with you, Alex. I provide a lot of critical information, especially for Canadians to understand. But this has been going on since after World War II, mostly in our countries, where communists basically not escaped or just transitioned from Europe and the UK into America and into Canada to start setting up this eventual revolution. And Pierre Elliott Trudeau played a big part in that, attacking the foundation of our nation, which is built on Christian principles, of course. So this morning, this is exactly when we're talking about how do you set up socialism? How do you set up communism? And again, this is all by design, and it isn't by chance. The article reads, at the same time, Canadians face suffocating taxation at every level. Income taxes, carbon taxes, fuel taxes, property taxes, payroll taxes, and consumption taxes. Governments run chronic deficits with little concern for sustainability, saddling future generations with debt while delivering diminishing returns and services. Unsurprisingly, investment is fleeing. Canada has become a hostile environment for businesses and capital. Endless red tape. It makes it impossible, of course, with all of the Indigenous land claims as well. This ties up all of our energy, mining, forestry, agriculture. Social cohesion is also unraveling. Crime is rising, particularly violent and organized crime. And so the report goes on, and it's incredibly accurate. We've got a two-tier justice system as the United States and every Western country is experiencing. The mass migration, again, is these are boots on the ground military for the globalists and the communists. I think we could look at it that way. And then in the end, in the article that I wrote, I said the United States has every reason to view Canada as a growing security liability. Every major enemy of the U.S. is operating within our borders. And then I asked the question, is that will Trump feel compelled to Maduro, Carney, and Trudeau? And I mean, there's a lot of people that would like to see that happen, because I do not truly believe they are legitimate prime ministers as well. And then we have Premier David Eby in British Columbia, who used the machines in 2024, and there's 100%, there's no question in the majority of people's minds that election was stolen.
In times of financial uncertainty, securing your wealth is more important than ever. With inflation, market instability, and economic challenges, many Canadians are turning to one timeless strategy: precious metals. Gold and silver have historically retained their value, offering a hedge against economic turmoil and a safeguard for your assets. If you're looking to invest, there's good news for members of Action for Canada. We're proud to announce our partnership with Steve Merrill of Sun City Silver. Steve is not only a friend of the freedom movement, but he's also offering Action for Canada members exclusive access to some of the best pricing in Canada. Thanks to his extensive client base and affiliation with Silver Gold Bull, you can now secure your precious metals at incredible rates. Silver Gold Bull is a trusted Canadian leader with live pricing available 24/7 and nearly 400,000 five-star reviews on Trustpilot. When you purchase through Steve, you're not only investing in your future, you're also supporting the freedom movement, as a percentage of each sale helps support Action for Canada. Plus, there's a bonus. If you place an order of $5,000 or more, you'll receive a 1-ounce pure silver bullet, a unique and valuable addition to your collection. And if you refer someone who places a $5,000 order, you'll get another silver bullet as a thank you. To get started, visit actionforcanada.com/purchasing-precious-metals/. Remember, your decisions are your own, and we recommend doing your own research before making any investment. But with Steve Merrill's guidance and our partnership, you'll be on the right path to securing your future. Secure your assets, protect your future, support the movement. Visit us today to learn more.
So on that, can you go into this very important part of our conversation regarding the elected interference and rigging that seems to be activated in Venezuela as well?
Yeah, well, that was one of the many things that they were doing in Venezuela. Again, Venezuela needs to be thought of as a Cuban colony. And they recognized that elections was going to be probably the most important vehicle for them to take over the countries that they still did not control. And they also recognized that they weren't going to be able to win elections legitimately. Of course, even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. And so communists don't usually say, hey, we're communists, we're going to enslave you and take all your stuff and enslave your children. They say, oh, social justice. And, they use all that. But you can only do that so many times, right? The people of Venezuela tried to throw off the tyrants using the electoral system multiple times, but they were rigging the election, right? So how do you free yourself? So what happened in Venezuela was under Cuban leadership and direction, they began building tools to steal elections, hardware systems and software systems that masquerade as elections systems, election equipment, that were actually designed not to tabulate or count votes, but to rig elections. It was the entire purpose of this whole scheme. Now, there have been endless amounts of shell companies and strange transactions to try to conceal what's going on here. But ultimately, if you go back to the beginning of Smartmatic in Venezuela and then the different companies that have owned these things and acquired it, they have been rigging elections, not just across Latin America, but even in Europe, even in North America for years. And it's an incredible network. Now, I can tell you this for sure. This was one of the things that was on Donald Trump's mind when he ordered this highly controversial and certainly very bold mission to capture Maduro. Trump obviously takes it personally. He won the 2020 election, but through a variety of schemes was defrauded out of that victory. He knows a lot of this now. They've got sources that have revealed a lot of this. Patrick Byrne, former CEO of Overstock.com, has been involved in this. General Michael Flynn has been involved in this. They've got people within the CIA. They've actually got people now from within Venezuela, some of them in federal custody, who are spilling the beans on all of this. It's very encouraging that we now have, for example, the former head of Venezuelan military intelligence, El Pollo Carvajal, revealing a lot of this. So it's all going to come out eventually, I hope. It's going to be fixed eventually, I hope. But people need to understand these people have been rigging elections for years. And it's not just in Venezuela. It's not just in third world dictatorships. It's even in countries that we think of as advanced or developed economies very much including right here in the United States.
Yeah, well, I think about Keir Starmer, and I think there's no way the majority of citizens have actually elected him into office. I don't know. I just can't see it. But, speaking of Maduro, and I was watching, it was yesterday, it was an interview that Marco Rubio was having with a CBS person who was interviewing him. And oh my gosh, she just embarrassed herself. I was so impressed with the way that he conducted that interview, because she was like, okay, so you went in and you took out Maduro. Why didn't you go in? And because she started naming the minister, the vice president as well, who's apparently just a wicked, evil woman, possibly more wicked than Maduro, the head of defense and other departments. And Rubio just clearly said, well, do you understand the operation to go into a military base where Maduro happened to be located? Can you imagine going into other military bases all in the same night within 10 minutes and, taking out the most official person that could possibly take down this regime? So it is a matter of time. I believe that putting the sanctions on the oil is also a motivator by Trump in order to maintain control until the U.S. has stated that they are going to be involved until there is a democratic election, which to me I'm a bit confused about, because in 2024 there already was an election. There is an official president, and that he should actually be provided that position. Would you agree with that?
Well, even the last election that they held, certainly the opposition candidate won, but even there were some very, very important problems, right? They have the Consejo Nacional Electoral, the national election body or whatever, that is responsible, on paper at least, for certain important constitutional functions. They actually disqualified multiple viable candidates based on the whims of the Maduro regime. So I do think it's important for them to have another election. I absolutely share your concerns about Delcy Rodriguez. Her and her husband are incredibly wicked people. They are masterminds of this criminal conspiracy. There's a lot of very clever analysts who I've spoken with who actually believe that Delcy is even more important than Maduro, Delcy and her husband. So I wouldn't trust them as far as I could throw them. I think the lesson has been sent loud and clear. You mess around too much, and you might find out the hard way that you need to stop. But I do think they need to have another election. Personally, I don't like what Trump said the other day, that we're going to run Venezuela indefinitely. And I don't know that that's actually what he meant. But, after the experience we had in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think the U.S. needs to be very weary of running other countries. But certainly they do need to have an honest election. I think the regime in power right now is completely illegitimate. They're actually following their continuity of government protocols that were put in place before Maduro was removed. So I hope the Trump administration can find a way to have a secure, real election down there as quickly as possible, and allow the Venezuelans to decide their future on their own without a mass murdering dictator puppet of Cuba oppressing them and starving them and rigging the election.
Well, I agree. I do believe that they need to finish what they've started, though. And the reason is, we look at Iran right now, and, the U.S. stepped in and really helped the revolution by taking out some of the most dangerous tyrants, extremists, I think that the world has ever known. And so we know that in Iran, it's not on mainstream media, but what started out as an act of revolution about 2 weeks ago, with millions of people coming out, taking control of police stations and really advancing, maybe less than a dozen people were murdered 3 days ago. And then all of a sudden, the Iranian regime realizes they're really losing control, and there will be a collapse of their oversight over Iran. And so they've brought in basically Islamic militia are coming in with their automatic weapons and wiping them out. And something needs to be done. I don't think the world should be standing back and allowing this any longer. And then that was my concern for Venezuela, knowing that there are still dictators who are very much in control. Can you explain to our viewers why it was legitimate for Trump to step in, explain the Monroe Doctrine, and why this involves the Western Hemisphere, and why that's substantial right now?
Yeah, so the Monroe Doctrine was articulated by James Monroe, and the idea was that the Western Hemisphere is not going to be a place for foreign empires and foreign ideologies to be messing around. And James Monroe was very much a non-interventionist. He did not believe, like most of our founders, did not believe in, as George Washington put it, going abroad seeking monsters to destroy. We want peace and friendship and commerce with all nations and permanent entangling alliances with none. But he did believe that we needed to protect the Western Hemisphere from the absurdities that were going on in Europe at that time with the various empires and the conniving and the never-ending wars and things like that. So that was the Monroe Doctrine. Now, Donald Trump has articulated what he calls the Donroe Doctrine. And this is kind of an expansion of the Monroe Doctrine. So let's first talk about the legitimacy of what Donald Trump did in Venezuela. Well, our Constitution does put the war powers with Congress, and our Senate actually just voted to restrict Trump from being able to take any further military action in Venezuela as a result of that. They want him to not be able to send boots on the ground or anything like that without permission from Congress. And Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution does say that war is something that is decided by Congress. Congress is who declares war. And so I can certainly appreciate that. But if you go back in our history, there's also a lot of nuance to that. Thomas Jefferson, obviously one of our most important founding fathers. He was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. He's one of the best known founding fathers. He was a very ardent constitutionalist, and he was also a very ardent defender of the idea that Congress makes the decisions about war and when to engage in it. But even Thomas Jefferson, when Islamic terrorists masquerading as governments, the Barbary states, were kidnapping Americans on the high seas and selling us into slavery and attacking our ships and attacking our commerce, he didn't ask Congress. He sent the U.S. Navy, he sent the U.S. Marines and pounded them into submission and said, you will stop kidnapping Americans, you will stop doing these things to us. So, nobody can accuse Thomas Jefferson of not being a constitutionalist, and even he saw fit without congressional approval to dispatch the U.S. Navy to deal with what would properly be regarded as foreign heads of state, foreign governments, sovereign states, whatever, because they were directly attacking Americans, they were kidnapping Americans, they were selling us into slavery, and they were stealing our ships and interfering with our commerce. So there's a lot of nuance here. Even more recently, of course, President Bush went into Panama and grabbed the dictator Manuel Noriega, and he was brought back to the United States, and he was put on trial, and he was convicted, and he spent, I think, about 17 years in prison. Then he was sent to Europe to go serve some more time in prison over there. So there is a time and a place for the U.S. government to intervene when America's under threat, when our direct interests are under threat. And what Trump said is absolutely true. If he had gone to Congress and said, hey, guys, I'm thinking about grabbing this mass murdering dictator who's not only abusing, starving, destroying, murdering his own people, but who's also killing Americans, who's got foreign operatives all over our country, committing sabotage, stirring up revolution, there are at least a few dozen members of Congress who are card-carrying members of the Communist Party USA. They don't say that, who are members of the Democratic Socialists of America. They would have been on the phone immediately with the Maduro regime, say, hey, Trump's coming to get you. Watch out. So, I certainly understand where Trump is coming from. And I think Trump looked at this and said, yes, people are going to be mad. Yes, Congress is going to be mad. But the alternative is these people are literally planning to take down our country. They're destroying our lives of Americans. They are preparing to foment revolution, not just across the region, but in the United States. And so I think that was what was going through Trump's mind. And I think what we'll see as this goes through the courts is he's going to be proven correct. We'll see. I don't have a lot of confidence in the courts, but I think just based on the precedent that they have set before, this is all going to end up being found legitimate and constitutional. We'll see where it goes from here. Now, the latest national security strategy that was put out by the Trump administration, I think there's some serious deficiencies in it. And I've shared my concerns with some of the people involved. For example, there is almost no mention of the CCP. Right? There's almost no mention of jihad and Islamic terrorism. Why? Those are pretty important threats to the national security of the United States. I'd like to see more emphasis on that. What appears to be happening is that some of these ideas of Curtis Yarvin, kind of a philosopher. I don't know how familiar Canadians are with him. He's kind of the new kid on the block. He's got some very interesting ideas about politics and geopolitics, but he has essentially articulated a vision of a world order where the United States kind of takes charge in the Western Hemisphere. The CCP is allowed to kind of own the region over in Eastern Asia. And then Putin, the Kremlin, and maybe some of the European powers, maybe the European Union, can kind of focus on Eurasia. And I have some concerns about that strategy. I don't believe we should be giving the CCP free rein. I certainly don't believe we should be giving Putin or the European Union free rein. But, at the same time, there's got to be an element of pragmatism. The United States is $40 trillion in debt. Our military has been all but destroyed by a successive series of administrations that was far more interested in hurting our military than building it up. And we've got a lot of catch up to do now if we want our Navy to be able to keep up with the CCP Navy. Putin and the Chinese have very advanced weaponry that hasn't all been disclosed publicly. And unfortunately, America has been deliberately handicapped in our ability to deal with these things. And even worse, the deep state in the United States has been building up communist China. They've been building up the threat of Islamic Jihad to where now it is a very real threat to our national security. So I understand what Trump is trying to do in the Western Hemisphere, and I appreciate a lot of what he's doing. I think we need more emphasis on Islamic terror and jihad, and I certainly think we need a lot more emphasis on the CCP. But really, step one would be very simple. Cut off the funding coming from the United States. Hold accountable those leaders in government and business who have given all of our technology to the Chinese Communist government. Hold accountable all those who betrayed our country. And I think just taking those actions would deal a devastating blow to our geopolitical foes.
Wow, that's really loaded. The statement that you just made, I could go into like 4 different conversations on that, because we know that going in and capturing Maduro had a real hit on Beijing, Huawei, their system that was supposed to, well, it was all fraudulent, I think, coming out of Chinese from the articles that I'm reading, that their capacity to be able to, in advance, see a threat coming has been proven, it's been dismantled by the United States very, very quickly, because they led a very stealth operation. I'm a little bit of loss for words right now to explain this, as far as the systems that China was supposed to have helped Venezuela and other countries put in place so there wouldn't be these kind of attacks. I look at something that you said that I really want to put perspective on for our viewers as far as what this war looks like. I've called it a war unlike any other, because we're not seeing bombs dropping, we're not seeing hand-to-hand combat. What we are seeing is drugs being used to weaken Western civilizations, and it's been devastatingly effective, Alex. And there was a fellow by the name of Wayne Allen Root. I'm not sure if you know who he is, but he said this is a war to save our children. And then he gave some stats that I'm going to read right now. 58,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War, 116,000 in World War I, 407,000 in World War II, 600 to 700,000 in the Civil War. He then goes on to say that this drug war is an undeclared worst war of all time, a war only being fought until now by one side. In this undeclared war, foreign enemies have been waging war against our children and our society without consequence. Over 100,000 Americans die each year from drugs, more than 1 million in the past decade, and 2.5 million deaths since the year 2000. And this is only in the US. This is not including Canada or other Western nations where, and you're 100% right, the fact that the CCP isn't being addressed, but maybe Trump is doing it in the way, as I mentioned, that going against their intelligence network that was supposed to see this threat coming. They've exposed that. This is going to be quite a hit against Russia and Beijing as far as oil sanctions are concerned. And then what is going on in the United States right now, we look at the Red-Green Alliance or Red-Green Axis, and that's the communists and the Islamists work together to destroy Western Christian nations. And this has been a very, very effective. I would say the United Nations are 2/3 basically communism, the majority, and a third Sharia compliant, which means that they fully support Islam and Sharia, Islamic law. And so the together of them, and that's why I'm saying we should be exiting the United Nations completely, 100%. And that war is waging in Canada. We have the CCP, police stations, election interference at the highest levels of government. We have the Muslims that are operating freely in Canada, the jihadis, the Khalistani Sikhs, and as well as the Hindus. And we're talking on massive operation. And I would say that the CCP are definitely a concern, but the Muslims are a greater concern because they are so well organized worldwide to create their objective of a stealth jihad, and they want world dominance. And they told us what they want, and they're doing it. And then if we can just shift for a moment, because I think that point is very important in the United States, we see a tremendous amount of activity taking place with Ted Cruz putting forward a bill to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist group. I'm pursuing a bill like that in Canada, but we don't have support from the Conservative Party at this point. And, people need to understand that the war on the soil is going to be coming up in these next elections. You better be ready to start being boots on the ground to help elected officials get into office, because the life and breath and the future of our nations relies on this. So tell us a little bit more about what's happening with Islam in America, and if you think there's hope in eradicating this threat. I mean, removing Islam completely from the West.
Yeah, and what we see here, I actually talk about a red, green, blue axis. We've got the Islamists, we've got the communists, and we've got the globalists. And we had the Director of Policy and Planning on the National Security Council in 2017, during the first Trump administration, wrote a marvelous memo. I encourage everybody to read it. It's called the Higgins Memo. You should be able to find it very easily. And he described this international alliance of globalists, communists, and jihadists who he said were working together for the purpose of destroying the United States of America, not just as a nation, but as an ideal. And I think that's what we're watching here, right? Islam has always been a threat to civilization and always been a threat to innocent people everywhere. But it's so backwards that they really were not a major threat to the United States of America until our government opened up the borders and started importing them in huge numbers. The same is true for Canada. I mean, before they got the technology from the West, they were so backwards they could barely feed themselves, right? Islam is a very destructive ideological and political system that produces nothing, that destroys everything. And so, yes, Europe was threatened constantly by Islam. They had multiple Islamic invasions. But here in America, it really wasn't a big deal. I always remind people, and this is even true in Europe, until globalist and communist politicians voted to open up the borders and start mass importing Muslims, there was no real Islamic threat. All the armies of the Muslim world combined could not have come close to American soil if we had not invited them all here, if treasonous forces within our own government had not invited them here. So why did they invite them here? Well, I think the reason is very simple. They want to use them to destroy America, to destroy our country. And so you do have this alliance that on the surface seems very bizarre. Why would they be working together? Well, that's because they have a common enemy. That enemy is Christ. That enemy is Christian civilization. That enemy is the United States of America, because, of course, it is a Christian civilization built on Christian principles, very similar to Canada, very similar to much of Western Europe. And so I don't think any of these threats can be understood on its own. Yes, Islam on its own is always going to be a threat to people who are in the nearby vicinity, right? If you don't believe me, ask North Africa, right? North Africa was at one time Christian. North Africa at one time had civilization until Muhammad's armies came through and chopped off everybody's heads and forced everybody to either submit to Islam or pay the jizya tax. So we're going to have to deal with this. But I think to deal with it, we're first going to have to deal with the forces within our own government that did this. Now, to go to communist China, the same exact thing is true. Communist China would not be a threat to the United States of America was it not for the treasonous forces within our government and within our business community that, first of all, put the communists in power, and second of all, build. The same is true with Cuba, by the way. We can talk closer to home. We're talking about Venezuela. Who put Fidel Castro in power? 100% the work of the U.S. government. And that sounds crazy to people today who don't know the history. The U.S. government put Castro in power with help from the New York Times. It was the State Department's idea. The New York Times, they had a fake journalist, and yes, fake journalists even existed back in the 50s. His name was Herbert Matthews. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he went to Cuba and told all America that Fidel Castro was a freedom fighter who was going to liberate Cuba from this terrible fascistic regime. The guy was our ally, by the way, Fulgencio Batista. And anybody who didn't like him must have something wrong with him. They actually called him the George Washington of Latin America. That's the kind of outrageous propaganda that these traitors in our country were selling us. Now, people with a brain knew that he was a communist. The U.S. ambassador to Cuba, his name was Earl Smith, said, guys, he's a communist. You guys are crazy. Stop doing this. He wrote a whole book about it called The Fourth Floor. It's marvelous. He gave testimony in the Senate saying the U.S. government put Castro in power. The founder of the John Birch Society, Robert Welch, said Castro is a communist. Don't believe the State Department. Don't believe the New York Times. Why did they put Castro in power? For the same reason they brought Mao to power. I've got a whole hour-long presentation about how these very same sinister forces brought the Chinese Communist Party to power. Why did they do that? And then why, for decades, did they build up Communist China? Communist China was so backwards in the 1980s, they could barely feed themselves. They certainly couldn't build a navy that could project power. They couldn't do anything. I mean, they were still struggling to literally feed and house and clothe their own people. And yet the World Economic Forum and the U.S. government, Rockefeller dynasty, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, decided we're going to build up this thing into a super state. David Rockefeller actually wrote in the New York Times, 1973, the column was called From a China Traveler. He said that the social experiment in communist China under the leadership of Chairman Mao, he said, was the most important and successful in human history. Why would a guy like Rockefeller, probably one of the richest men to have ever lived in the history of humanity, praise the Chinese communist system? Why was he so buddy-buddy with Fidel Castro? Why are they doing this? Well, it's because they want a one-world totalitarian system. These people are not Muslims. They loathe the Muslims just like they loathe everybody else. These people are not communists, right? Yes, they funded the Bolshevik Revolution, as documented by Stanford historian Anthony Sutton in Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, but they're certainly not communists. Why are they doing this? Because they want a satanic one-world system, and they are working to build it, and they're using Islam, and they're using communism, and they're using every other subversive ideology you can think of to try to bring it about. So there's several levels that I think you can look at this on. Martin Luther, I think very wisely looked at the Islamic invasions that were happening in Europe at that time, right, 400, 500 years ago, to argue that this was actually God unleashing his judgment on a Europe that had become wicked and had ceased to follow God and his commands. And I think there's certainly an element of this. I don't think God would have let our countries get into the trouble that we're in if we had followed him, if we had honored him, if we had not driven him out of our schools and our legislatures and our halls of government. So there's all these different levels to look at it on. But now we do have, as you pointed out, a very serious problem. We've got millions of people in this country who want to overthrow our system of government and impose Sharia. We've got the CCP waging what they describe as unrestricted warfare, which very much includes getting our people addicted to drugs and overdosing them, which very much includes economic warfare and biological warfare. And so what do we do with them? Well, I would say the first step is we've got to stop the bleeding. We've got, and Trump is doing a very good job at this, stopping the flow of capital and technology to China. And obviously, maybe it's a separate issue, but I have no idea why the Trump administration recently decided to allow the Chinese communists to purchase very advanced microchips from NVIDIA. I think that was a very bad idea. It's exactly the kind of stuff I'm talking about. But if we're going to stop this, I think it has to begin in our own legislatures, in our own government. And, to deal with the Islamic threat, to go back to your original question, we're going to have mass deportations. I'm sorry, but, you got to go. You got to go back to Libya. You got to go back to Syria. You got to go back to Afghanistan. Hopefully we can evangelize these people and they can come to learn the gospel and they can go home and they can explain the Bible and truth to the people of their countries and they can make their countries great. But without any doubt in my mind, if we're going to survive as a society, we're going to have to do mass deportations of all the people that have been brought in over the last few decades.
Yeah, I agree. And I am so happy to hear Western nations around the world that are saying the same thing. And multiculturalism was never, ever, ever meant to be a success. Pierre Elliott Trudeau brought that in because he knew that it would destabilize Canada. But he messed up. But for lack of knowledge, Canadians are going to perish because they don't understand our history and our founding documents. They want to poo-poo the coronation oath, which states very clearly that we need to be governed by biblical principles. That is powerful. That is a win for us, because the top two commandments say, "You shall have no other gods before us, or make for yourselves idols," which means that 100% we have every right to shut down every mosque, every Islamic center, every temple, Hindu temple, and every other false belief. And in our charter, people will say, "Oh, it's multiculturalism as part of Canada." And they have to remember that it starts with a preamble about the supremacy of God and the rule of law, colon. And the colon means everything after that must comply with the supremacy of the God of the Bible and the rule of law, which was based on biblical principles, which means we shouldn't have multiculturalism day in our schools, leading our kids astray and into false deities and belief systems, because our kids are going to hell. And if you don't understand how serious this is, I don't care if I offend anybody else anymore. They've come to my country and they're offending me. And so it's time to say, either, look, you've got your nation you can live in that supports your false gods and your false belief systems that are destroying the nations you came from. Why do you want to set up all of these silos here in Canada and America under these false belief systems? So no, I believe that God is calling us out for turning our backs on the biblical truths and the biblical teachings in America, in Canada, in Europe, in the UK, and we need to take this very seriously. And I believe that God will meet us. I believe that God will protect us and give us a way to do this. And right now, the U.S. is definitely on the front line. And you are right. If America goes, the rest of us go. And they're setting up Canada to be a deadly threat against the United States with the way they're allowing us to be infiltrated with extremism, the CCP, and other networks. And so, Alex, I know it's been an hour and you and I could continue, because this is such a massive topic, but I think that we've given our viewers a lot to think about. And as far as solutions are concerned, and you guys are, as I say, are making great headway in the United States, what would you recommend to people as a few of the top priorities that they should be putting in place in order to mobilize them as well?
Well, I would start with get on your knees and pray. Open up your Bible. Go to the Word of God for insight and instruction and ideas on what we should be doing. The body of Christ is one body with many members. We all have different functions. God's given us each different talents and abilities and resources. So let's figure out, what did God give us and how can we put those to use in this incredible battle against Satan and the world and the flesh and the devil. We've got to do that. I would urge parents in the strongest possible terms to remove their children from the indoctrination camps immediately. Homeschool or find a good Christian school after you thoroughly vet it to make sure it's in alignment with biblical principles and your values. Those are some of the most important things. Then get involved in the political process. I love what you said earlier. We have to get involved in the political process. If you can't run for office, fine, I understand that. Find somebody who's running and support them. If you can write them a check, I don't know how Canadian politics works, but if you can write them a check, write them a check. If you don't have money, then go knock on doors. Do what it takes. The evildoers have dominated the political process for so long. Christians have sat on the sidelines, and it has resulted in a cataclysm. We've got to stop that. We need decent, honorable men and women of God to get involved in the political process. But it begins in our own homes. That begins with our own children, with our own families, and then we work outward from there. Get active in a Bible-believing church if you aren't. And, again, go to the Word of God. Be in prayer, and I think we really do need national repentance. We do need to be involved in politics, but at the same time, America, Canada, Western Europe, we've murdered our babies, we've desecrated marriage, we've done so many wicked things. We need national repentance, and I want to urge people not to be demoralized or lose heart. I love what you said, Tanya. If you read the Old Testament, you'll find example after example of God using small groups of people, or even dispatching an angel to do incredible things, right? He dispatches one angel to slaughter 185,000 enemy troops, and we're going to be scared of George Soros and, politicians. Give me a break, right? Bill Gates. God is the creator of the heavens and the earth. He is the sovereign over all the universe. He often uses little people, David, to take down giants. He uses people like Gideon and 300 men to crush the Midianite army. Read about Elisha when this massive army had come against him, and his servant's like, oh no, what are we going to do? And he prays that God would open his servant's eyes, and suddenly he sees the spiritual battle where God's angels are all over the place. So folks, don't be disheartened. God is still in charge. He did not abdicate the throne. Satan's going to end up in the lake of fire. We just have to follow his instructions in the meantime.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Alex. And I do believe that raising up the church, raising up leaders is incredibly important. God didn't appoint the 12 tribes of atheists. He appointed the 12 tribes of Israel, and he was very, very clear to appoint godly leaders. And that's what we need to be doing. We need to really care about the people that are being elected and into office. And I'm talking at all levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal. I was really discouraged earlier today. I was going through my emails and I get this letter from a pastor in Manitoba. I was sickened by what he had to say. And we're up against Bill C9 right now. And that is a hate speech bill, and it means to make it illegal to quote Bible scripture as if it's hate speech. And Mark Miller claims to be a Christian. And so he was saying that there was parts of the Bible that are hateful and need to be removed, not removed, but there needs to be hate speech laws against them, which means good people like myself and others, that pastors could be arrested if this were to pass. So we've got a massive campaign. We've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that are responding and taking action. And this is the voice. These people think that, they're going to be elected again. But if millions of Canadians and Americans stand up and they make their voice known, that this changes the future. It changes elections. And education is everything. Knowledge is truly power. And when you have that, you need to share it. So join groups like Action for Canada that are mobilizing citizens and providing them, educating them, and providing effective resources. Definitely, if you're in the United States, even if you're in Canada, sign up with Alex Newman, follow him, join his Substack. Follow him on his X account. And is there anywhere else? Buy his books, share his books with elected officials, help to educate. Right now, I was in a chapter leader meeting earlier today for our big 2026 launch. And we have our marching orders. It is to proclaim Canada as a Christian nation. It is to lobby government. It is to minister to government officials and work towards changing their hearts towards Christ. And we believe, with the power of Jesus helping us, that we can attain our goals. And if you don't, as Alex had said, and as we're witnessing, the other side is very activated and motivated. In Canada, the Muslims have a get out to vote. They talk about it in their mosques during voting season. In the United States, they just voted in something like, was it 50 or so people into office, and they shouldn't even be allowed to run. And we need to speak these truths out loud. This is a Christian nation. They don't align with our values, and so they need to be removed. And we're going to continue to work towards that. So, Alex, give me a favorite scripture before we sign off. Give our viewers a scripture that would give them encouragement right now.
Well, I love Ephesians 6. The whole chapter is amazing. But Ephesians 6, 10, 11, and 12 talks about standing firm against the devil. Talks about putting on the armor of God. It talks about battling against powers, principalities, spiritual wickedness, the rulers of the darkness of this world. And, we have the armor of God with us, and we have the sword of the Spirit, which is our Bible. And so I would just encourage people, recognize we're in a spiritual battle. Everything is on the line. Yes, it has political manifestations and educational manifestations and all kinds of different ways that it is manifest, but it's ultimately a spiritual battle against the forces of hell. We need to remember that, and that should be encouraging to us because our God is sovereign. Our God created all things, and our God will determine how far they can go, when they must stop, and when they're going to end up in the lake of fire. So, I would encourage people to go read Ephesians 6. It gives you some really clear instructions for the battle ahead. And, go forth joyfully doing the will of the Lord.
Excellent. Thank you so much. You are one person that is having a huge impact in the United States. I am one person having an impact in Canada. We are each one person that has the ability, when we lean on God, to say, yes, Lord, use me, that we can have an amazing, huge impact. So be used by the Lord today. Alex, God bless you. Keep up the great work, and we look forward to you visiting us on the Empower Hour again.
God bless you too. Thank you so much, Tanya.
Wow, to me, that was just an amazing interview with Alex and so informative. I'm going to ask that you please share this information with elected officials. The video will be up shortly. You can find it on our webpage. Please give us a thumbs up, make a comment, and because this helps us with the analytics. We're being very censored and shadow banned because it's obvious, right, that we're doing such good work. We are that squeaky wheel in the background, lobbying government and really working for change. And so we just thank all of you for your support, and we pray that you will continue to do that. And then so for next week, speaking of mobilizing Canadians, we're going to have another chapter, Empower Hour, and it's going to be a campaign to call on Canadians to join our chapters, but especially to become chapter leaders, because we are accomplishing really, really amazing things at the community level. And can you imagine if we had chapter leaders in communities where we have elected officials, federal elected officials across Canada? And we're talking about lobbying government at the provincial level, at the municipal level, and of course at the federal level. All hands on deck, and we'll give you everything that you need in order to support you to do that. So now, as always, I have chosen some Bible verses, and I think that they're very applicable. I love what Alex had finished off with. It works so well. He was talking about Ephesians 6, and I happen to also love Ephesians 5:11, which says, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. And that's exactly what Action for Canada has been doing for 10 and a half years. And in so doing, Canadians are becoming more well-informed and educated, and then they are compelled to get involved. And that's super important, is to get Canadians actively involved. Luke 8:17 also says, for there is nothing hidden that will not become visible, and nothing secret that will not be known and come to light. And again, this is very important scripture. As we go to expose evil, we are exposing those in government with a very nefarious agenda to destroy our democracy. Knowledge is power. So we must be working to expose this. We must actually need to make that effort ourselves to be informed. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And that's from 2 Timothy 1:7. And again, so we're moving through this. We understand that, that we're up against tyrants and against people with a very evil agenda. But if we're going to be cowardly about it, then we are not going to survive this. We will fall into communism and a dictatorship. So it's very, very important that we know through the power of the Lord that he does not give us a spirit of fear. That's from the enemy. You do not have to be fearful in speaking the truth. So we must rise up with power and love and a sound, courageous mind. And then finally, Deuteronomy 20, verse 4, says, for the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to save you. And I take great comfort in that. That's what helps me be courageous. That helps me go fearlessly into the future. If I know that this is the truth that we are proclaiming and speaking, then the word of God is very clear to us that we do not need to fear our enemy. If anything, we should fear God, because our country is in this mess right now because we were silent in the face of murdering millions of Canadian babies through abortion. We were silent when marriage was desecrated in agreeing to substantiating same-sex marriage. There are so many things. We were silent in the face of all of these false gods being given the opportunity to rise up in our nation. That is bringing our children down a very concerning path. We need to rise up uncompromisingly to the word of God in love and in faith. So with that, I just want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. God bless you, and God bless Canada.
vision. We are going to be in every town and every city, and we are going to build communities within these communities of like-minded people who are actually going to care for one another again and love on each other and give each other the help when they're down. We are going to use the teams and the people that build within chapters to support our businesses. The government's actions are completely 100% unlawful. Judgment will again be found on justice, and those with virtuous hearts will pursue it. You have a virtuous heart if you are here today pursuing freedom and righteousness. And then verse 23 comes along with a promise. God says he will turn the sins of evil people back on them. He will destroy them for their sins. I take great comfort in that because I serve a mighty